I'd like to invite Professor Sussan Neuman from New York University. Professor Neuman will speak on how we can change the odds for children at risk, policies for encouraging reading with preschool children. And she'll tell us something about evidence-based policies and what the evidence
Thank
tells
you.
us
It's so
about.
wonderful to be here today. It's so wonderful to be back in Israel. And thank you for the wonderful invitation. And thank you all for organizing this very, very important conference. So I want to start by telling you a little bit of my professional roles. Today, I'm a teacher educator and a researcher. But prior, in 2001 to 2003 and a half, I was the U.S. Assistant Secretary for Elementary Education and Secondary Education in the U.S. Under the President George W. Bush. And I was in charge of $22 billion in research and education funding. And one of the things that I saw, and one of the things that was startling to me, was the amazing growth during that particular period in terms of how much money we were actually spending in education. That the amount of money that went into education grew dramatically during these years. And then I wanted to tell you about the problem, that none of these programs were particularly effective for poor children. That despite all the $22 billion that we spent and the effort that we put into education, very, very little had an effect on children's achievement and children's desire to learn. So one of the things that I wanted to do is I wanted to understand why we were so ineffective. And I wanted to note that we saw the same results again and again, that children of color often had difficulty in learning to read, that children of families who speak a language other than English, because as you know, U.S. does not prize multilingualism like many of our other countries, and then children of poverty were not succeeding in our schools. And the reality is something that you all are very familiar with. These children who come and from poverty, from those circumstances, will likely come to kindergarten very low in skills. They're likely not to know their letters, their sounds, their numbers, their colors. They cannot write their name as well as middle-class children, and they have very little sight word vocabulary. And note specifically the differences in the sounds of our language. So one of the things that has intrigued me is that people in the United States really care. I do believe that they care about children's achievement. But this is a famous quote from one of our past vice presidents, Walter Mondale. And he said, "What I have not learned from researchers about helping poor children is what we can do about these problems. For every study that contains a proposed solution, there is always another challenging the assumptions of the first. No one seems to agree with anyone else. As a result, I must confess, I stand with my colleagues confused and often disheartened." In other words, our politicians often don't know what to do. They know the problem, they don't know the solution. And so as Assistant Secretary, I tried to understand, where have we gone wrong? What has been our problems throughout these years? When and how have we failed our most vulnerable children? And I think one of the ways in which we have failed is when we oversimplify the problems. That the problems are deep, and they go deep in many different ways. I think we have not understood the complexities of what poverty brings to our children very early in their years. My experience with understanding children of poverty tells me that it has very, very long-term effects, that children will remember having living in poverty even after they are now, if they're able, to live in the middle class. That has long-term effects. And one of the things that its concomitants, or what happens as a result of poverty, and many of you, and you were describing, it was described before in our first talk, is they will have limited material resources, that many of our parents will not be able to engage children in cognitive activities because of limitations in their resources. Secondly, those resources are often involving and related to the interactions and the involvement over activities. So when you and I take our children to places, we talk about that. And when there are no places to go to, it's very difficult to have something to talk about, something good to talk about. And then we know that our parents often lack social capital. And this is a term that has involved me a great deal. What that means is that these parents of poor families often do not know how to negotiate for their child. They don't know how to advocate for their child. They don't know how to help them in the school or with their homework, or they don't know the importance of reading to their children. So they lack the social capital to make life work for them. So when my child in school had difficulties, I knew how to get him help. I knew to change schools or to get a tutor to help that child. These parents often don't have that experience. I think another way we fail is when we don't start early. And you see, I have in parenthesis, enough. Many of us are talking about preschool, but we're not talking about early enough. So many of our children we know from this very famous study of Hart and Risley that children's language begins much earlier than age 4, and we need to be much more sensitive to the very beginnings of language. And Fernald has come up with research that shows that we're seeing differences as early as 18 months, that we're not starting early enough to engage our families in oral language development. And some of the attachment that Janet Buss and others have talked about that is so important. Eye-to-eye contact from parent to child that is the beginnings, actually, of literacy. I think we also fail when we forget that parents are an absolute critical component of what we do in education. In the United States, someone brought up No Child Left Behind. No Child Left Behind parents and forgot that parents were the critical factor that enabled children to come to school ready to learn. This is an example, and I wanted to show you this not because I want you to look really at the graph, but this was endemic to me of what we see too often in the United States. In this particular school district, there was a rule, and in fact all across No Child Left Behind, that if children have difficulty in reading, they could get help. So this was the graph that went out to parents showing what they had to do in order to get that help. Can you believe that? Yeah, where's that? It's actually in that little box right there. But they had to go through all those other boxes first to get help. This is just one school district. So it's telling you what we think about parents when we think about education early on. So what I think are the problems? I think we've had very weak interventions. Their interventions have not been strong enough to affect the enormous issues related to poverty. I think we have programs that are too low in dosage. They aren't intensive enough. They aren't long enough. Our attention span goes from one thing to another too quickly. And third, I think we have ill-fitting interventions. Interventions that are not targeted to the needs of these poor children well enough. And as a result, we are not well focused in what we really need to improve. I want to then start and talk about solutions, what I think are policy-related solutions. And I wanted to start with what I consider my theory of action. The first theory of action is called the Matthew effect. Many of us know about the Matthew effect. It's from the Gospel of St. Matthew. I'm not aware of, I don't know the biblical background, but the bottom line is it's about the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And this theory basically says that children who lack sound knowledge, remember that earlier graph I showed, or phonological awareness, often come to school lacking an understanding of the alphabetic principle, the connection between sounds and letters. Because they are delayed in that initial phase, they become delayed in beginning to read. That beginning to read then causes, more or less, lack of interest in reading. And lack of interest causes lack of doing it. They don't do it quite so much. And consequently, over time, there's an enormous gap between those children who are reading a lot, those children who are not reading a lot, and it causes the achievement gap. And many of us are very familiar with the Matthew effect and the deleterious consequences of that. But I work under a different theory of action, and that is called the knowledge gap. And what that recognizes is that we live in a knowledge economy in this world today. The global world is talking about a knowledge economy. And what that means is you and I have got to help children develop knowledge and background and information. Information is critical. And so here's what happens in my theory of action, that children lack access to oral language development. Oral language is, of course, associated with phonological awareness. But oral language is a little bit different than just phonological awareness. Because as parents talk to their children, what they are doing is conveying knowledge. It's not just words that they're talking about. What they're talking about is things and information. And when children are not talked to early on, what they are not getting is vital information that will help them negotiate their world. So oral language brings knowledge to our children. And then print instantiates or increases that knowledge. So in other words, we know that book reading is the central way that you and I get knowledge. That when something happens, you and I watch television perhaps and watch it in digital form, but we quickly want to go and read about it and develop a deeper knowledge base. So what children are coming to in our schools is lack of information through oral language development and through print language development. And children who come with those limitations are going to have difficulty in comprehension development. Comprehension is about background knowledge and learning using background knowledge to gain information from text. And as a result, those children will have a lack of reading instruction in terms of their skills, but they'll also consequently at the same time have a lack of information. And that will feed to a lack of being able to read content or more sophisticated texts with comprehension, and it will lead to a lack of what I call information capital. So these children will eventually have a limited amount of knowledge. Now, what does that mean? What are policies then that can support a knowledge and improve a knowledge gap theory? What do I believe children need an evidence-based approach, not based on our heart, but based on what we know in terms of the research and evidence. I want to show you a study we did just this year. I know you can hardly see this number, but this is about the summer slide. Have you ever heard that term? The summer slide means that many of our children go to school, they learn, but then they're off for the summer, and they just slide down. So what we did is we did a national study in the United States of what books would be available to our children in the summer. And what books might they have? Because many of our children don't go to camps. And we went to an area, 3 different areas across the country. One was Washington, D.C., our nation's capital. Second was Midwest. It was Detroit, which you might have heard of. And then finally, it was Los Angeles. And we looked at poor areas, and we looked at middle-class areas. And to give you a horrible situation, we could find no books available for children in poor areas in the nation's capital. Not one. We did not find one preschool book for thousands of children. There were 1,500 children lived there. We found a total of 5 books in elementary school for these poor children. They were dictionaries. That's fun reading. And then finally, we found only about 2 books for our poorest children in all of this community. So why I bring that up to you is I say that access to books is so critically important, and that if children don't have that access, not only in school, but outside of school, they will not become literate learners. They will not become information gatherers. They can't. Second, we need greater attention to oral language development. And many of us in our schools are focusing too much on ABCs, but are not focusing enough on the language that we are conveying with our children. Knowledge, oral language, as I mentioned, is knowledge. And what we said is we've done 2 meta-analyses focused on poor children. And the good news is that intervention, when it's there, works. Effect size 0.89. That's very high, very high. The bad news is that very few teachers do it. That there are very few teachers who actually teach oral language or vocabulary in our schools. And so therefore, that has got to be a push. Sometimes I would like to see ABCs taken away and oral language just used with our children. Second, we need more powerful instruction. We need explicit and implicit instruction. You brought up the issue of whole language. In our country, we're still seeing whole language, though we know it doesn't work, especially for the poor children who lack the understanding of abstract language many times because of lack of experience. Children need explicit definitions of words in child-friendly ways. They need also meaningful instruction that puts these words into a strategy that they understand. Learning words away from context is meaningless for children. So one of the reasons I love to work in early childhood is because these children do not accept nonsense. When something is silly, they will tell you. When something is meaningful, you will see it. So this instruction has to be done in meaningful ways. Greater attention to the texts we choose. I think this is a strategy that we have under-recognized, that the text can teach. The text can help us. And one of the ways in which we can do that is we can understand different genre of texts and what they promote for us. So for example, we have interventions working where we use highly predictable text. And when we use highly predictable, or the language is very similar, and rhyme and rhythm and song, what we find is the children remember those words. It becomes a device to help them remember. So if I say to the children in the United States, I'm going to read a wonderful book, chicka chicka boom boom, will there be enough room? And the children will say to me, look who's coming up the coconut tree, because they've memorized what I've said to them. And those kinds of books are very memorable to children. They become part of them. Secondly, there are narrative stories that have a story grammar that they will remember. But they're very strong in helping us remember the story grammar, or what constitutes a story. Finally, there are information books. And information books are so powerful to our children because they teach them information. They teach them valuable information. So what we do in our interventions is we put these books together in what we call text sets, where we start with a predictable, we go to a narrative, and then we hit an informational book, which has greater vocabulary and greater density of concept. We also know that different interactions can support learning for our children. So one of the things we like to do in the very beginning with children, especially poor children, is we do what we call chiming. So if I say to the children, chicka chicka boom boom, will there be enough room? The children will say, I'll turn, and they'll say, look who's coming up the coconut tree. So in other words, chiming is an interaction between the children and the reader. And that's great because it creates a participation. Then secondly, they're closed-ended questions. And closed-ended questions help us understand whether or not children are learning from the text. And then finally, there's open-ended questions where we get children to discuss and talk about that book. And this is when the creative language and the focus on their ideas interact with actually what happens in the book. So parent involvement is absolutely essential in what we do and has to be an important policy ramification in everything we do in early childhood. One of the things we know and what we've learned is that when we try and teach parents how to read to their children, sometimes what they do is they ask too much labeling. Do you know what I mean by labeling? They say, what's that? What's that? What's that? Almost as if they're interrogating the child, you know. But what we've learned in a recent study we've just published is that parents who are responsive to their children's interests and their children's questions have children who have higher expressive and receptive language, that actually their responsiveness can mitigate poverty. And that some of the things that we find is that when parents respond to the children's questions, guess what children do? They ask more questions. And when they don't respond, we find that they ask less. So getting parents to learn how to be responsive and listen to their child and put down that cell phone and look at their child when they're reading is so critically important to them. So what is our changing the odds strategy? It must require greater access to books. Libraries are wonderful, but libraries in our areas close at night. And they are not available to our children. They're in areas that are dangerous often and difficult. We need more access. 2, we need greater attention to oral language and oral language development. which is so essential for knowledge development, as well as phonological development and vocabulary and comprehension. 3, we need greater attention to the texts that we use and how they can support what we're learning about reading. And then greater attention to what we say in those books and how we use what we call extra textual language. Finally, I always say we need to be accountable. We need to look at what we're doing and evaluate every part of our strategy. We've got to measure how much money to put into our programs. We've got to monitor their progress, and we've got to look at effects. And you know what? We've got to often say, it doesn't work, let's try a new strategy, because we cannot continue to fail our children. We need everyone at the table. Schools alone will not help us. What we need is a school and a community that is sufficiently powerful and targeted to help our poor children read and to become a successful learner. When I say that, what I mean is a 360 surround for our children. Community-based programs that will help them, family support that gives them love, attention, and knowledge, early care and education, and then finally safe communities where they can walk to libraries. Thank you.